My name is Zora Banks. I'm 35 years old, and for most of my life, I believed one simple thing. If you show up, if you carry the weight nobody else wants to carry, eventually somebody notices. I was wrong, but stay with me. Being wrong is where this story actually starts. It was 7 o'clock on a Tuesday evening in the house I grew up in on Innis Street in Houston's 3rd Ward. The chandelier over the dining table threw down the same warm yellow light it always had, over the same oak table with the water ring near the head chair nobody ever talked about. Outside, the porch swing that had been creaking since somewhere around the Eisenhower administration, my nephew Marcus called it the Old Dragon, groaned once in the wind, and a light Houston rain tapped the windows without ever committing to a real storm. My father, Malcolm Banks, sat at the head of the table in his dark suit, gold watch catching the light every time he moved his wrist. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't look at me. He just slid a black leather folder across the table, and the paper inside still smelled like fresh toner. He said my sister's name like it was scripture. Imani. She'd flown in from New York 8 days before, hair freshly done, phone glowing beside her fork. I had run 2 senior care facilities, Banks Legacy Senior Care, in Acres Homes and in Sunnyside, for 13 years straight. Not one full week off. My mother, Serenity, sat beside him, hands folded, eyes on her plate. She nodded slowly. That nod was the loudest sound in the room. I didn't argue. I didn't blink. I set 2 things down on the table, right next to that folder. A notarized power of attorney and a heavy set of metal keys to both buildings. The keys hit the wood with a sound like a knife against a cutting board. Every eye in the room turned toward me. Andre, Imani's husband, relaxed as always, a man who'd learned long ago that in this family you agree with whoever's speaking, let out a low whistle. Imani smiled like she'd already won something. They thought I was surrendering. But when Imani opened the red envelope I'd left sitting beside that folder, her eyes went wide and her breath caught in her throat. She never made it past the second line. I was 12 the first time I pushed a wheelchair down a hallway at Acres Homes, the whole place smelling of antiseptic and lavender lotion. My father walked ahead of me, greeting every resident by name. "Careful, Zora," he told me once, then turned right back around to charm a visiting church group. Imani was 7 then. She wore a white dress that day, twirling in the parking lot while our mother took photos in front of the building sign. I was in the corner of that photo, half a body, wiping up a spill. I was 24 the year Sunnyside nearly closed over a missed payroll. I carried my grandmother Evelyn's engagement ring, the one thing of real value I owned, to a pawn shop on Scott Street at 11 at night. The next morning, my parents thanked me with a nod, then spent the afternoon showing off the new Mercedes they'd bought for Imani's birthday. That same week, I was charging my mother's phone when the screen lit up with a message from 7 years earlier. I hadn't meant to see it. "Malcolm, don't worry. Zora will handle the heavy lifting. Imani just needs to show up. Let her think she matters." I stood there 17 seconds. Then I locked the screen and set the phone down exactly where it had been. They'd been planning to use me long before I ever noticed. My 17th birthday, I remember a half-melted grocery store sheet cake sitting crooked on the counter. Imani got sparklers and 14 relatives that year. My mother kissed my cheek and reminded me not to forget my evening shift. The mortgage needed the money. That's the woman standing in that dining room now. 13 years of every holiday, every crisis, every 2 a.m. phone call about a medication error. All of it landed on me. Quietly. The way rain falls on a roof nobody bothers to mention because it's always raining. Back to that Tuesday. Back to my sister, holding a red envelope, unable to finish the second line. My phone buzzed once in my pocket. A message from a number I didn't recognize. "They're getting ready to replace you. Be careful." I didn't answer it. I just smiled. Small, quiet, barely there. My father needed the applause more than he ever needed the truth. A man who built his whole identity on being admired in hallways, terrified that without an audience clapping for him, he might not know who he was at all. That fear is why he could look at 13 years of my labor and still call it nothing. It was never really about Imani. It was about him needing a mirror that only reflected good things back. Something in me had shifted, though. Not that night, long before it. And nobody at that table knew it yet. Here's what they didn't know. Over the past year, quietly, without telling a soul, I had already started moving pieces into place. The folder my father slid across the table thought it was handing my sister a future. The envelope I slid back was the first sign that the ground under that future wasn't as solid as they believed. As the shock of the letter held everyone's attention, I did one small thing nobody noticed. I reached across the table, slid the keys and the power of attorney back off the folder, and slipped them into my coat pocket. Nobody stopped me. Nobody was even looking at me anymore. I stood, I said nothing more. I walked out into the rain without an umbrella. They thought I was surrendering. They were wrong. And this time, for the first time in a long while, I wasn't standing there alone. The morning after came in quiet, the way betrayal usually does, not with shouting, but with an email you weren't copied on. A nurse I'd trained 11 years back forwarded me a state inspection notice. My name had been removed from the CC line. Nobody told me. I only found out because somebody still cared enough to slip it to me sideways. That afternoon, my mother texted me a photo, Amani in front of the Sunnyside sign, hair blowing in the wind, captioned, "Future Leadership, #Banks Legacy." That evening, I walked into the kitchen on Innis Street. My father was leaning over the counter with Amani, talking about a 10-year vision and a new color palette for the website. Neither looked up when I came in. My father finally turned, smiling. "Zora, don't worry yourself with the paperwork anymore. You've done enough. It's time Amani carried some real responsibility." My mother touched my wrist. "You're so good behind the scenes, baby. Let your sister shine. Let me take you back 3 years to understand what behind the scenes had actually cost me." I'd been offered a position as director of nursing at a hospital system in Dallas, nearly double my pay, housing assistance included. I flew out, signed the preliminary paperwork. That same night, my mother called in tears because my father had been rushed to Memorial Hermann again. I withdrew my acceptance in an email sent at 2:17 in the morning and packed away every plan I'd made to leave Houston. Around that same time, I'd been engaged, quietly, privately, to a good man who wanted a life outside Houston, away from 2 nursing facilities that never stopped needing me. I chose the facilities. He didn't wait around for me to change my mind, and I never blamed him for it. The morning after I turned down the Dallas job, an anonymous email landed in my inbox with a bank statement attached. Every month, $4,500 had quietly moved out of the operating account, the account meant for resident care, into Amani's personal account, labeled Creative Brand Consulting. My parents had approved it 36 times. Imani never set out to be a thief. She grew up being told her only job was to look beautiful and be loved for it. So she genuinely believed creative consulting was real work, because performing had always been treated as labor in this house. Underneath the highlights and the brunch photos was a woman terrified that without the spotlight, she'd simply disappear, the way I had disappeared into every hallway of that building for 13 years. I didn't correct it, I didn't say a word, I just closed the folder exactly where I'd found it. That night, I opened my laptop to a blank document and started writing. Not a letter, a timeline. 13 years of Medicaid audits, the 2020 staffing crisis, the near loss of our license in 2021, 47 nights sleeping in a hospital chair the year my mother had her stroke. What I hadn't told anyone yet was that this timeline wasn't the beginning of my defense. It was the continuation of one. A little over a year earlier, after watching my parents quietly favor Amani in one decision too many, I'd already gone to Elijah Thornton and started asking what protections existed for the people inside those buildings, separate from whatever my family decided to do with the business. That Tuesday night simply told me the quiet groundwork was over. At 5:40 the next morning, I drove to Elijah's small office on Dowling Street, its window glowing before sunrise. He didn't ask why I'd come. "They're moving without you," he said, "and you've stopped asking to be seen." He called Raven Porter. She arrived with a leather case and read through everything in 18 minutes. "They're planning to hand this over," she said, "but they don't understand what they're actually handing. The license is the backbone. The protocols you built are intellectual property. Your relationships with the state and the caseworkers, that's institutional capital. None of that transfers with a smile and a ribbon cutting." "There's something else," Elijah added, quieter than usual. "Your grandmother Evelyn came to see me once, years back, not long before she passed. She asked a lot of questions about what happens to a family's assets when the people running things can't be trusted to run them fairly. I always wondered when that conversation would matter again. I didn't understand what he meant yet, but I remembered it. Quincy Griffin explained something I needed to hear clearly. Your father's will names you heir to the business assets, but a will only means something when someone dies. It does nothing to stop your parents from mismanaging things while they're still alive. That's what the foundation is for. It protects the residents now. We built the Harbor of Freedom Foundation, a nonprofit to hold the brand, the protocols, the resident data, every partnership I'd spent over a decade building. My parents signed off on what they believed was an honorary advisory role, paperwork they never read past the signature line. Meanwhile, Imani walked through both facilities with a pink leather notebook, suggesting the walls be repainted peach. The staff looked to me for guidance. I only nodded. Near the end of that week, Raven sent a message that stopped me cold. "Someone on the inside has been sending us documents. They want to help. They said Zora deserves this." I didn't know who that person was yet, but for the first time in 13 years, I understood something important. I wasn't the only one who'd been watching quietly all along, and this drama family had more silent witnesses than anyone at that table realized. My mother, meanwhile, kept hosting her little porch gatherings, sweet tea with Betty from 2 doors down, like nothing in this house had changed. My father kept calling Imani the future of this family in front of vendors who'd worked with me for a decade. I let him believe it a little longer. Andre knew about the missing money and said nothing for months. Loyal husband caught in an impossible spot, or just as guilty as Imani for staying silent? Team Andre or Team Guilty? Drop your verdict below. The night before the family legacy celebration at the Eldorado Ballroom, that beautiful old building on Dowling Street with so much history woven into its walls, I sat in a small office behind the nurses' station at Acres Homes. I wrote a letter to my sister, not angry, just clear. You're about to inherit an empty shell. There's no system underneath it yet, no preparation behind it. The foundation exists to protect the people who live in these buildings. What you carry forward from here depends on what you choose to hold on to. Before I printed it, I opened my desk's bottom drawer. Underneath old paperwork sat a small black USB drive I'd kept hidden for almost 2 years. On it was a recording from a 2022 meeting, my father's voice clear as day. "Just let Zora keep running things. Once Imani's back, we'll ease her out. She doesn't have a family of her own, so she won't fight it." I'd been carrying that knowledge a long time. The evening of the celebration, the ballroom glowed warm and golden. White linen, the smell of soul food, laughter bouncing off ceilings that had heard decades of Houston's history. My father tapped his spoon against his glass. "Tonight, we celebrate the future of this family's work." He turned to Imani. "You're ready to lead." My mother smiled. "You've earned this." The room applauded. I stood up slowly. No rush, no raised voice. I placed 2 things on the white tablecloth, the power of attorney and the red envelope. Imani opened the envelope first. Her eyes moved fast, then went wide, her breath catching. This can't be right." She stood so clarify her chair screeched against the floor. My father snatched the paper from her hands. His face went pale, reading the section about the brand, the protocols, the operating rights, all of it now legally held by the Harbor of Freedom Foundation. "Zora, what have you done?" My mother grabbed another page. "This says we don't own anything?" I spoke softly, clearly. "Those 2 buildings are just buildings, just brick and drywall." My father looked at me, loud enough for every guest in that room to hear. "You don't have a husband. You don't have children. Imani is the one who carries this family forward. What you've done here is support work, nothing more. That's when Raven Porter stood from a table near the back, where she'd quietly blended in with the guests all evening. She raised her phone and turned the speaker up. Security footage from the hallway at Acres Homes played clearly through the ballroom. My parents' voices discussing plans to fire every employee loyal to me the moment Imani took over, with no trace left behind. Their voices echoed off the high ceiling. Andre's face drained of color. An aunt near the front set down her spoon. The room went completely silent. My father's public cruelty in that moment wasn't really aimed at me. It was self-defense. Admitting my worth out loud would have meant admitting, in front of every guest who mattered to him, that he'd built his whole legacy on someone else's back. His pride couldn't survive that math, so he reached for the only weapon he had left, shrinking me down to no husband, no children, because it was easier than facing what he actually owed me. Quincy Griffin rose, his voice level. Every document in this package is accurate. These transfers were completed legally under a power of attorney that Miss Banks has held without interruption this entire time. If staffing ratios drop or if care protocols deviate by more than 5%, Harbor of Freedom retains the right to revoke the operating license within 60 days. No license, no operation. Imani sank into her chair, the red letters sliding to the floor. I thought I was inheriting something real. I looked at my sister. You were. A system, a responsibility, a job. You just never bothered to look at it before now. I turned and walked out of the El Dorado ballroom. Outside, a light rain was falling. I didn't open my umbrella. My heels clicked against wet pavement. Behind me, through the heavy ballroom doors, I could still hear the murmur of shocked voices. I didn't turn around. For 13 years, I'd imagined what it might feel like to finally be seen in that room. I'd always pictured it loud. Instead, it came quiet. A folder, a recording, and a silence so total you could hear rain hitting the awning outside. My phone buzzed as I reached my car. Raven. That went about as well as it could have. Tomorrow, we start the 60-day clock. I sat behind the wheel a long moment, watching the rain streak the windshield, watching the ballroom's warm light blur through the water. Somewhere out there, a woman I hadn't met yet, the one sending me quiet warnings for weeks, was watching this unfold for reasons of her own. 60 days. The clock had started. I intended to use every one of them. A week after the celebration, my parents called an emergency family meeting at the house on Ennis Street. They believed they could pressure me into handing everything back. The rain from the night of the El Dorado ballroom had never really stopped. It had just thinned into the kind of steady Houston drizzle that soaks through everything without ever announcing itself as a storm. I sat in my car outside the house for almost 4 minutes before I went in, watching water bead on the windshield, listening to the porch swing creak once, twice in the wind. The old dragon, still groaning under its own weight, the way it had every summer of my childhood. Through the front window, I could see my father pacing, his shadow crossing the chandelier light again and again, the same warm yellow glow that had lit every dinner I'd ever eaten in that house. From the outside, it looked exactly like it always had. I knew by then that it wasn't. I brought Raven Porter and Quincy Griffin, both in dark suits, both carrying thick leather cases. My father stood the moment I walked in, so fast his chair scraped against the same hardwood floor I'd grown up cleaning on Saturday mornings. You betrayed this family. You betrayed your own blood. His voice cracked on the last word in a way I'd never heard before. Not fear yet, but something close to it. The gold watch on his wrist caught the light as he threw his arm toward me, the same flash I'd watched cross 100 dinner tables over 13 years. Except this time it looked less like confidence and more like a man reaching for a prop he wasn't sure still worked. A mother sat in her armchair crying, a tissue balled in her fist. The same armchair she'd sat in the night she nodded instead of saying my name. Imani stood beside Andre, still trying to hold the posture of a woman who believed she was about to become the future face of Banks' legacy. though I noticed her thumb moving in small, nervous circles against the seam of her dress. It was a habit I hadn't seen since she was 9 years old and about to get caught in a lie. Raven set a second folder on the table, the original will, notarized in 2018 at the Harris County Courthouse, the year my father nearly died from a stroke. She set it down without a sound, the way a surgeon sets down an instrument she already knows she won't need twice. Quincy opened to the first page. According to the original will, the sole heir to all intellectual property, brand rights, and operating authority of Banks Legacy Senior Care is Zora Banks. My father's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time in my life, I watched him have nothing to say. The room went silent. I looked at my parents and spoke softly. 13 years. I gave up an engagement because he didn't want to spend his life next to 2 nursing facilities. I turned down a job in Dallas the night you called me crying. I'm 35, and until recently, I still slept in my childhood bedroom. I'm not here today asking for anything back. I'm returning to you exactly what you once gave me. Invisibility. The word landed and sat there in the room like something dropped from a great height. Nobody moved to pick it up. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Somewhere in the kitchen, the refrigerator hummed on, ordinary and indifferent, the only sound in a room full of people holding their breath. That's when Andre stepped forward, voice shaking. I knew. 3 months ago, Imani told me to move money out of the facility's reserve fund into her personal account. She said our parents had approved it. I thought it was normal. But last night I found old messages. Imani once wrote, "Once Zora's pushed out, we'll sell part of the facility. There's enough there for a bigger place in River Oaks." I stayed quiet. I'm done staying quiet. He set his phone on the table, screen lit with the message. Imani's face didn't change right away. That was the strange part. It took almost 3 full seconds for what he'd said to reach her eyes. "You're betraying me?" Imani shouted at him. Quincy took Andre's phone and passed the file to Raven. My mother sobbed. "Don't you love your parents anymore?" I answered, calm. "I loved you for 13 years. Now I choose to love the elderly people you used to build your image." I heard Imani's knees hit the floor before I saw her go down. A soft, defeated sound against hardwood. Nothing like the porch swing's proud, stubborn creak. "Let me start over. I'm begging you." This was the first time in Imani's whole life that beauty and charm couldn't fix a room for her, and it terrified her more than the money ever could. Somewhere underneath the panic was a smaller, more honest fear that she'd spent 30 years being cast as the face of this family and had never once been asked who she actually wanted to be. Kneeling there, she wasn't just afraid of losing the business. She was afraid of finding out there was nothing underneath the performance at all. I looked at my sister. "You have 60 days to prove you're worthy of certification, not because of blood, because of the standard of care those residents deserve." Right then, her phone rang, the ringtone loud and tinny in a room that had gone that quiet. A staffer from Sunnyside panicked. "A resident in room 12 almost fell. We're short-staffed. You need to get here." Imani's hand shook so hard around the phone I could hear it rattle faintly against her rings. Imani looked at me, terrified. I said only one thing. "That's the system you just inherited." I turned and walked out of the living room. The wooden door clicked shut behind me. I want to tell you what that drive home felt like, because it wasn't triumphant. Watching my sister on her knees didn't feel like justice fully arriving. It felt like watching someone finally meet a reality that had been waiting for her the whole time, patient and unbothered by how long she'd managed to avoid it. I thought about the last time I'd sat in that living room as a girl, 22 maybe, half listening while my grandmother Evelyn talked quietly with my father about protecting what people build with their own 2 hands. I hadn't understood the conversation then. I'd been folding laundry in the doorway, half in the room and half out of it, the way I always seemed to be in that house. It would be years before I understood she hadn't been talking about the buildings at all. Andre's confession stayed with me longer than I expected. Not because I was shocked, but because of how ordinary his voice sounded saying it. Tired, the way people sound when they've been carrying something they didn't ask for. I kept replaying the flatness in it, like a man setting down a bag he'd carried so long his arms had forgotten what it felt like to be empty. I drove home past Emancipation Park, streetlights just flickering on. I thought about my grandmother, gone 11 years now, and wondered what she'd make of all this. One more chapter in a drama family history she'd tried so hard to protect me from repeating. My phone buzzed once before I even reached the apartment. A new message, same unknown number as always. There's something from before you were born that they don't know I know about. I'll tell you when the time is right. I read it twice, filed it away the way I'd learned to file everything else that didn't make sense yet, quietly and for later. That night, back at my apartment near the museum district, my phone buzzed again. Raven. They're not going to accept this quietly. Watch your back over the next 60 days. People who lose everything don't always lose gracefully. 60 days, a deadline my parents thought worked in their favor. They had no idea how wrong they were. I couldn't sleep that night. Not from guilt, from how strange the silence felt. I lay on top of the covers in my apartment, staring at a ceiling fan I never bothered to turn on, listening to Houston traffic hiss faintly through a window I'd forgotten to close. For 13 years, silence had never once been available to me. There was always a phone ringing, a shift to cover, someone's crisis waiting to become mine. Now the silence just sat there, enormous and unfamiliar, like a room I'd been handed the keys to but hadn't yet learned to live in. The house on Ennis Street had gone quiet in a way I wasn't used to. No 2 a.m. texts about medication errors. No reminders to double-check the schedule. At 5:50 the next morning, I drove to the Harbor of Freedom Center near Herman Park. The city was still gray and half asleep, sprinklers ticking across dark lawns, a jogger passing under a streetlight that hadn't clicked off yet. Sunrise caught the glass windows. Volunteers set up activity tables. Somewhere down the hall, someone tuned an old piano, and the notes drifted through the corridor like a quiet reminder that life kept moving forward, whether or not anyone gave it permission. A resident named Mr. Odom, 91 and always awake before the staff, waved at me through the glass doors before I'd even parked. He didn't know anything about wills or foundations or courtrooms. He just knew I usually brought him the crossword from the Chronicle on Thursdays, and it was Thursday. I stepped into my office, set the keys down on the desk, and let out a long breath. The first time in longer than I could remember that my shoulders felt like my own, not borrowed out to whoever needed them that day. A few weeks later, I drove past Ben Taub Hospital and glanced through the waiting room windows. My parents sat side by side, hands clasped, waiting on a Medicaid consultation. My father looked smaller than I remembered. Not thinner exactly, just diminished. The gold watch on his wrist suddenly too big for him. The way jewelry looks on someone who's lost weight they didn't mean to lose. My mother's hand was the one doing the holding. His sat inside hers, still. I sat at the red light a beat too long, engine idling, and for one unguarded second, I felt something that wasn't triumph and wasn't quite grief either. Closer to recognizing a stranger who used to live in your house. They didn't see me. I didn't stop. Around that same time, Imani started showing up at Sunnyside on her own. I watched her push a wheelchair for an elderly gentleman, movements clumsy but careful. She nearly clipped the doorframe twice, apologizing under her breath both times to a man who couldn't hear her. She'd traded the pink leather notebook for a laminated binder of care protocols, already dog-eared at the corners. She didn't notice me behind the two-way office window. I let her have that moment without an audience. Imani had spent 30 years being handed rooms that were already warm for her, a stage already lit, a spotlight already aimed. Nobody had ever asked her to build the room herself. Watching her fumble with a wheelchair break instead of a runway walk didn't look pathetic to me anymore. It looked, for the first time, like the beginning of an actual person underneath the performance. Someone finally doing something because it was necessary, not because someone was watching. That night, my phone buzzed with a message from the same anonymous number that had reached me from the beginning. You did the right thing. My mother is Eleanor in room 8. I sent you that 2022 recording, but be careful. Your parents just signed a new power of attorney for Imani at the hospital. They're trying to reclaim everything before the 60 days run out. They still have one more move. So that was it. The daughter of a woman I'd cared for personally for years had been feeding me the truth the entire time. It clicked into place then, the message from a week earlier, the one about something from before I was born. I hadn't understood it at the time. I still didn't fully understand it now, but I filed it away, quietly, the way I'd learned to file everything else that didn't make sense yet. I read the message 3 times. Raven called almost immediately. They're preparing to move. We need to move first. I sat in the dark of my office looking out at Herman Park. I thought about my grandmother more that night than I had in years. Evelyn Banks raised 4 children on a nurse's salary and a stubborn refusal to let anyone walk over her. I remembered her kitchen on Saturday mornings, the smell of sweet potato pie cooling on the counter, the radio low on a gospel station, her reading glasses pushed up into gray hair she never once let anyone touch for her, and the way she used to say, "Baby, quiet don't mean weak. Quiet just means you're saving your strength for when it counts." I hadn't understood what she meant until that night, staring at a message warning me my own parents were preparing one last legal move. I texted Raven back. Let's move first, but carefully. I don't want to win this by becoming someone I don't recognize. She replied almost instantly. Understood. We'll file based on the hospital's own capacity documentation. If your father wasn't of sound mind when he signed that new POA, it's void before it ever mattered. Elijah's words from weeks earlier came back to me. You don't need revenge, Zora. You need structure. Revenge burns out. Structure holds. I finally understood exactly what he meant. And I didn't know yet how much of what my grandmother had built quietly all those years ago was about to matter. I only knew the 60-day clock hadn't stopped just because I finally understood, a little, what quiet had cost her too. They believed 60 days was enough time to turn everything around. They had no idea I'd been building toward something like this for over a year, and that my grandmother, in her own quiet way, had been building toward it far longer than that. 55 days into the 60-day window, Harbor of Freedom received the Excellence in Senior Care Award from the city of Houston. The ballroom that night wasn't the El Dorado. It was smaller, a banquet hall downtown with plainer chandeliers and folding chairs instead of tablecloth linen. And somehow it felt more like mine than anywhere my father had ever stood to make an announcement. A city councilwoman read the citation, her hands trembling slightly around the paper, phone cameras flashing in a slow scatter across the room. Applause building gradually instead of arriving all at once. The sound of people who actually meant it. I stood on a small stage and invited the residents and staff to join me, instead of my family. Mr. Odom came up in his wheelchair, crossword folded in his breast pocket like a boutonniere. A nurse named Denise, who'd covered 3 overnight shifts the week Sunnyside almost lost its license back in 2021, stood close enough that our shoulders touched. For 13 years, I had stood at the edge of rooms like this one, holding a clipboard, making sure everyone else looked good. That night, for the first time, I stood in the middle of one and didn't feel like I was borrowing the space. Imani texted that week. I'm studying, Zora. I want to earn a real certification. I didn't answer right away. I sat with the message open on my phone for almost an hour, out on the small balcony of my apartment, watching the lights of the museum district blink on one building at a time. Some old, tired part of me wanted to type back something warm immediately, the way I always had, the way I'd answered every 2 a.m. text for 13 years without ever once asking whether it was fair that I always answered first. I made myself wait. Not out of cruelty, because for once, I wanted to see what she'd do with the silence, instead of filling it for her. 5 days later, the exact day the 60-day window closed, I invited Raven and Quincy to the house on Ennis Street one final time. I stopped at Woodlawn Garden of Memories on the way, something I hadn't planned to do, and stood a few minutes at my grandmother's headstone with my hand flat against the warm granite. I didn't say anything out loud. I didn't need to. I just wanted her to know, in whatever way that kind of wanting means anything, that I'd finally understood what she'd tried to tell my father all those years ago in that living room. The conversation I'd only half heard as a girl folding laundry in the doorway. Then I drove to Innis Street. My parents and Imani were already there, lawyers of their own beside them, wearing the confident smiles of people who believed they were about to win everything back. The chandelier was on, same warm yellow it had always been, and for a second, standing in the doorway, I felt 13 years old again, watching my father greet a room before he'd even looked at me. The porch swing outside creaked once as the wind caught it, the old dragon still keeping time the only way it knew how. Quincy set a folder on the table. The new power of attorney you signed at the hospital isn't valid. Medical records from Memorial Hermann confirm Mr. Banks was under high-dose pain medication at the time and lacked the legal capacity to consent. His treating nurse documented it in writing and confirmed hearing the conversation that led to the signature. My father's face went white, his hand finding the edge of the table like a man checking a doorframe was still there before trusting it with his weight. "There's something else," Quincy continued. "Years ago, your mother Evelyn placed this house, along with a portion of her savings, into an irrevocable trust, a common estate planning step for a family business. Malcolm and Serenity were named as beneficiaries, with the right to live in and use these assets during their lifetimes. But the trust included a standard no contest provision. If either of them ever took formal legal action to strip a named successor of her rightful inheritance, their beneficiary rights would end, and full ownership would pass to that successor. The power of attorney you signed at the hospital, the one just ruled invalid, was exactly that kind of action. Zora Banks is the named successor." I felt the room tilt slightly, though nothing in it had actually moved. 13 years of feeling invisible, and it turned out I had never been invisible to the one person whose opinion I hadn't realized I still needed. My mother's silence for 13 years was never peace, it was survival. She'd learned decades ago that disagreeing with my father cost more than it was worth, so she traded her voice for stability, one nod at a time, until keeping the peace became indistinguishable from betrayal. Watching her finally say, "I was wrong," wasn't weakness breaking. It was 30 years of self-protection finally running out of road. The room went still. My father sank into his chair. My mother pressed a hand to her mouth. Imani didn't cry this time. She just sat there, quiet, staring at the folder like she was finally doing the arithmetic on 13 years all at once. Andre stood and set his house key on the table. "I filed for divorce from Imani this morning. I don't want our children growing up inside this." His voice caught on children. I thought of Marcus, 9 years old now, who used to swing so hard on that porch swing my grandmother swore he'd bring the whole thing down one summer. I didn't want that for him either. Whatever else this family had gotten wrong, I didn't want the next generation inheriting our particular gift for quiet cruelty. "I'm sorry, Zora," Andre said. "I was wrong." My mother looked at me, really looked at me, for what felt like the first time in years. "I was wrong. I'm sorry." I thought of the nod from that first Tuesday night, the loudest sound in the room, once, without her meaning it to be. This was the opposite of a nod. It was the first full sentence I could remember her saying just for me, and not for my father's benefit. It came too late, and we both knew it. I stood, took the house key from the table, and slipped it into my coat pocket. "You chose Imani," I said. "The attorney read my name. My grandmother chose me a long time ago. And now, I'm choosing to leave." I walked out of the house on Ennis Street without looking back. The door clicked shut behind me, one final, quiet sound. A few weeks later, Harbor of Freedom had become the finest senior care center in Houston. We repainted the hallways at Sunnyside that spring. Not peach, the color Imani had once suggested with her pink leather notebook, but a soft, warm cream that Denise said reminded her of her own grandmother's kitchen. It felt like the right kind of compromise, not erasing what Amani had noticed, just building it on something that could finally hold weight. One afternoon, driving back from the courthouse with the final paperwork done, I found myself outside the pawn shop on Scott Street without entirely meaning to stop. The ring in the window wasn't my grandmother's. That one had been sold years ago, resized and passed into someone else's story entirely. But there was a small gold band in the case that reminded me enough of hers that I went in and bought it anyway. Not for anyone's finger, just to keep in the top drawer of my desk at Harbor of Freedom, a small promise to myself. Nobody who worked for me again would ever have to trade away the one thing they owned to keep somebody else's legacy standing. Eleanor, the resident whose daughter had quietly helped me from the beginning, took my hand one afternoon in the garden near Herman Park. The garden smelled like cut grass and the gardenias someone had planted along the fence the year before, bees moving lazy circles between them. Eleanor's hands were thin, paper-soft, but her grip was surprisingly firm. "You gave us back our dignity," she told me. "Now go hold on to your own." Somewhere behind us, a nurse laughed at something one of the residents said, an ordinary, unremarkable sound I understood, finally, as the whole point of everything I'd spent 13 years fighting for. I smiled. The first time in 13 years I felt fully free, carrying nothing that didn't belong to me. Every drama family has its ending. This one just happened to be mine. They chose my sister because she had a husband, children, a picture-perfect future. They forgot about the daughter who sold her grandmother's ring, who turned down Dallas, who gave up an engagement, who slept 47 nights in a hospital chair, who spent 13 years holding up a family that never once thought to hold her back. But when the lawyer read my name as sole heir, and when my grandmother's trust finally activated, everything they believed belonged to them came apart in a single afternoon. This wasn't revenge. It was simply the truth, arriving late, but arriving whole. This story reminds us of something worth saying, plainly, over coffee, the way a neighbor would say it to you on the porch. If you've spent your life being the one who holds everything together, here's something practical. Write down what you actually do for your family, the driving, the calling, the checking in, just for yourself, just once. Seeing it on paper is often the first moment people stop mistaking your love for an obligation. If you're a widow or widower rebuilding a routine, don't wait for someone to invite you into their plans. Call the friend, book the hair appointment, sign up for the Tuesday walking group at the rec center yourself. If a grown child never says thank you, you're allowed to stop performing gratitude on their behalf. A short, honest sentence like, "I need to hear that sometimes," costs you nothing and changes more than you'd expect. And if you're the one who was overlooked, know this. Dignity was never about being chosen by the people who overlooked you. It was about deciding, quietly and on your own schedule, what you still owed anyone and what you didn't. If this story stayed with you, stay with me. There are more stories like this one waiting, about women who learned how to let go without ever losing their dignity. And this time, I kept the house key, too.